Well, it's always fun to reminisce a little bit. I think about some of those years and those early days, at least for me, that the great successes we had. The company's earnings were always seemed to be ahead of the year before, and that was always gratifying to all of us that those things would happen. And I remember that in the annual meetings, Mr. Blazer would get up, and he always was just a master at handling security analysts and people like that. He would get up first of all, and he'd say, "Well, the company is having a great deal of difficulties in many areas." One, he was always concerned about the pipeline that was coming up from the Gulf Coast that would bring products into our marketing area, and he would always talk at length about that in the annual meetings and about the problems that would have for the companies and how it would bring the major oil companies and into the area, and it could be very competitive, and some of the problems that were facing us. And after he got through all of those enumerating all the difficulties we'd have, he'd look down at his sheet and he'd say, "By the way, I just want to say that this year we're going to have about a 35% increase in earnings," and have a big smile on his face. So he was always glad to make those reports, especially when they're good. But he'd always point out and make a point of all the problems that we faced at any time. And,
right.
So those were good days, and it was fun times. And of course, we had our share of travesty and tragedy and all those things. I remember so well that the night that the company plane, the Lodestar, went down. It was in 1962 in September. And I got a call that evening from Orrin Atkins, and he was trying to get the numbers of certain people that were on the plane. We had 13 people on that plane that night, and Jim Mahan, one of the outstanding new people that were coming on. I knew Jim Mahan in school. He was a little older than I was, but he was all-state basketball, all-state football, and honor roll student. And he was then in charge of our retail marketing in Buffalo at that time. But the plane took off, and flew from Ashland to Cleveland, stopped and left some people off in Cleveland, and then stopped in Buffalo and left some people off, and then picked up a whole new passenger group on the way back to Ashland. And for some reason, I don't think it was ever finally resolved, but somewhere over near Youngstown, Ohio, that plane went into a tailspin and went straight into a lake right near Youngstown. Of course, everyone was killed instantly, and there was a lot of investigations and all, but I think they came down that there may have been a problem with one of the flaps, the motors going on, pull the flap down, but I don't think it was ever really resolved. But we know that Lodestars were not. We had two of them those days, and never had any problems with them. And we had a outstanding mechanical crew that kept those planes right up to date. But since then, it's become renowned that Lodestars were not a good airplane, and they had a lot of problems, a lot of crashes. So, but in any case, those are things that's like in anybody's life or in families and all. You have all your great things that happen, and your sad things come along too. But
Sure.
That was a real trauma for a small company back in those days, and getting through that, and the families and all the things that were a problem. But thinking about after I once became executive assistant to Rex in 1965, my whole perimeter of the company changed then, because I got an opportunity. It was a great opportunity for me to see so many different operations in the company. I remember Rex took a great deal of pride, of course, in Allied. That's where he came from, and Allied Oil was a fine company. They sold all the heavy fuel for the company, for the corporation, for all our refineries. They took that and sold it. And then they also were smart enough to get in the brokerage business with heavy fuel. And Frank Colgrove was the head of Allied at those days, and Billy Davis and let's see, it was Billy Davis was up there early, and then Dwayne Gullett came in later, and Billy ran Allied for a while, and then so did Gullett. But it was a great group, and they would make enough brokerage profits over and above what they sold from the heavy fuel from our refineries, and that was quite an operation. And it was Rex took a great deal of pride in it, and of course that's where he came from.
He was president.
He was president of Allied, and of course that's when Mr. Vanderveer sold his company, Allied, which is the refinery in Canton, Ohio. Well, Rex Blazer was the president. And of course there's an interesting story there, is that when Rex came out of University of Illinois, and his uncle, Paul Blazer, in other words, Paul Blazer was the younger brother of Rex Blazer's father.
I see.
So Rex was Paul Blazer's nephew. And so Rex came after, when he graduated, a year after Everett Wells did. Everett Wells graduated, I don't know, forgotten what year, but it was a year before Rex. But Everett came to Mr. Blazer, and Mr. Blazer hired him. And Everett Wells was the first president of Ashland Oil,
Right.
after Paul Blazer. And but then it wasn't, of course, Everett was what we call the first salesman of Ashland Oil. Mr. Blazer always said that about Everett Wells. And Everett Wells was an outstanding person, outstanding man that made important contributions to the corporation over the years. But in any case, Rex came, and Paul Blazer came and asked Paul Blazer for a job. Rex told me this story. And Paul Blazer said, well, says Rex, says, I would like to hire you, but I just think that it'd be best not to, because we're a small company, and of course we got the family connection. But he says, I will call my friend up at Allied Oil, Jim Vanderveer, or W.W. Vanderveer, Jim Vanderveer's father, and Mr. Newman, and they may have a place for you. So they hired Rex Blazer. And they not only found a place for him, it wasn't long till he became the president of the company. He did an outstanding job, and both of those men, Flood Newman and W.W. Vanderveer, were great supporters of Rex. And so when the merger came to the two companies, well, Howard Marshall was the president of Ashland Oil at that time. And J. Howard Marshall had been a renowned oil man, and still is to this day. I think he's still living, but made a lot of money. He was well in big circles of the oil industry. But in any case, he came to work for Mr. Blazer and was president of the corporation. He and Mr. Blazer fell out, and I remember Mr. Blazer in a number of board meetings, and I've attended most of those board meetings. Most of the time I was serving coffee and making notes and doing those kind of things, but I took it all in just the same. And Mr. Blazer would always talk about a certain contract that was being written, and some way J. Howard Marshall didn't put a clause in that contract that offended Mr. Blazer, and that was the end of J. Howard Marshall. But this time the merger with Allied was just taking place, and it wasn't very long after J. Howard Marshall that Rex Blazer became the president.
The president of
Ashland Oil Inc.
Ashland Oil and Refining.
Ashland Oil Refining Company in those days.
And
right.
What was Everett Wells' position at that time, Bob?
Everett was executive vice president.
I see. Okay.
And so that Mr. Blazer had been the chairman, and then Jim Martin was the chairman.
I see. That's
Jim Martin, one of the boaters named after him.
okay.
Jim Martin was Jack Allard's uncle.
Is that right? No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's not a real familiar name to me. Jim Martin.
Jim Martin was the chairman of the company. And then Mr. Blazer was the president, and then Everett Wells worked for him, and then was executive vice president. And then Rex Blazer came in, and he became the president, and Mr. Blazer was the chairman. Everett Wells was executive vice president.
I see. Okay.
And it wasn't long after that Mr. Paul Blazer, decided to be the chairman of the executive committee. that was a committee on the board. And he made Rex Blazer chairman, and Everett Wells president. And that was the management line for a good while. And but Mr. Blazer, it was always clear who ran the company. Paul Blazer, even though he was the chairman of the executive committee of the board instead of chairman of the total company at that time, the total board. He was the man that called the shots.
Is that pretty much true of the board meetings also? Did he?
Well, Rex always presided, and but Mr. Blazer, he had such a way of when he would talk to people, he would do it in such a low tone of voice that everything would get quiet, and whatever he had to say, everybody listened to. And but in any case, it was clear in those days, and Rex was clear to Rex, and he'd tell me in case, and everybody knows that Paul Blazer runs the company, even though I'm the chairman. He understood that clearly. But actually, in those times, Rex took a great deal of pride in Cleveland Tankers. That was part of Allied at that time, and that played a key role up on the lakes, Great Lakes, that operation, and we'd have big parties up at Cleveland every year, a big annual meeting, and go through the trauma of having union problems and all those kind of things would come about. And actually, there weren't union problems; there was this threat of union a lot, so that made it difficult at times.
We still have that operation, Cleveland Tankers.
That's right, still there, and that was one of the ships that just recently burned up on the lakes.
Right.
But I remember the story. It was funny in those days that after we'd had the big annual meeting, there was sort of a tradition that we would go upstairs in Rex's big suite, and all the people in Cleveland Tankers, many people from Ashland would come. And I was his executive assistant, and he'd said, "Now, Bob, you go down and get corned beef sandwiches." That was part of the tradition. I'd bring back a big tray, and there would be a piano in the suite, and we'd all sing songs. So I went down to this little place at the Statler Hotel in Cleveland, and I went down to the little roast beef place, which was nothing more than a bar with a delicatessen next door to it, same place. And so I went in and I said, "I want 25 corned beef sandwiches." Well, that was probably the biggest order that this guy had ever had since the last meeting we were there. Right. So he'd say, "Well, buddy, it's going to take a while. You might as well go in the bar and sit down, and I'll call you when I'm done." I said, "Okay." So I go in the little bar and I sit down, and there's one guy sitting there, and he's talking to the bartender. And I'm sitting there, and I said, "I think I ordered a beer," and I was waiting for the sandwiches. And so I thought the fellow looked familiar to me, but I couldn't quite place him. And when he was saying, "Well, when I was making all those movies and so forth," well, to make a long story short, it was Nelson Eddy.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. And so, of course, just the three of us there, Nelson Eddy and Bob McCowan and the bartender. So I thought, I was always thinking in those days, I thought, boy, I said, "Well, Mr. Eddy," I said, "I sure admired all your films, and you and Jeanette MacDonald, all these things." And he was a nice guy. And I said, "Let me tell you something. I've got my boss and a lot of my bosses are all upstairs in the Statler in a suite, and we always get a piano and have a little sing fest. Would there be a chance that you could take 5 minutes and just come up and say hello to the group, maybe sing a song or something?" Well, he said, "I'd love to do that." And I said, "Well, great." He says, "On one condition." He said, "I have a date tonight." And of course he was it seemed like he's well in his 70s then. And I said, "Is that right?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Now, she should have been here a half hour ago. And if she's not here in the next 5 minutes, why, I'll go up with you." I said, "Well, I'm waiting on this guy with the corned beef sandwiches." So I waited another 15. I kept waiting. I said, "The sandwich is ready?" And so it took another half hour. So just as we got to sandwiches, I said, "Okay, well, let's go." He said, "That'll be fine." So he gets off, and we walk out to the door of the bar there, me carrying all the sandwiches. And just about that time, the most beautiful woman I ever saw walked through the door, and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm late, Nelson." See, well, I kept saying, "Do you want to go up?" He didn't even notice me from anymore.
That was it.
And that was it. So I went upstairs to tell everybody that, and nobody to this day believes that story.
That's funny, Bob.
But in any case, I think about all those things. It's fun. And Valvoline was coming on in those days. Valvoline was a small company that we acquired. Mr. Blazer was part of the whole chain of operations, Allied and Frontier and all those companies that we'd bought. And Valvoline had been operating fairly well, but in Ashland we had, as you remember, Walter, Old Gold oil.
Oh, yeah.
We had the Ashland brand. So there was a big discussion in those days. How do we fit all these motor oil brands together? And Valvoline was the oldest name in petroleum, not just motor oil, but in petroleum. Here's a great name, but it was going to cost a lot of money to advertise that name and do all these things. So one day we decided to have a meeting. I got the meeting all together. I forgot now who all was there. Mr. Blazer and Rex and Everett and Palmer Talbot and all the brass was there. And Orrin may have been there. I just can't recall. But Bill Seaton might have been there too. But in any case, the discussion came around whether should we really dedicate a lot of capital expenditures to advertising and all the things for Valvoline, or should we just go ahead and promote our Ashland brand? Earl Weaver was in the meeting.
Right.
Of course, Earl Weaver was a big part of Valvoline because it reported to him in those days. And so the decision finally came down that we would make the commitment to Valvoline, that we would put capital expenditures in it, and then we would provide enough money for advertising and all these things, and see what we could do with this great old name in motor oil, and in the petroleum industry for that. And so as a result of that, we started to make those capital expenditures and make that commitment to advertising. And there we had Valvoline now. It's one of the great things. And that meeting, as I think back on it, could have gone either way. There was a lot of reasons. We happened to always seem to be strapped for cash. And money was always going into going into refineries. And but that decision was a good one, and it was will long be remembered as one of the great things that happened, a great decision to make.
Would that have been in the old board meeting downtown?
Yeah, it was downtown in the
Winchester
Avenue in the boardroom up there when all this was made. We hadn't even moved or thought about moving in those days. Mr. Blazer was still alive. And then, of course, we had Mr. Blazer was always particularly interested in asphalt. He thought that was a way to upgrade the bottom end of the barrel and get more for it in the premiums, just like he was interested in petrochemicals. That's when he had John Hall and people like that working on petrochemicals and refinery people. Bob Yancey, of course, was playing a big role all of this time, and was the head refinery man, and made us just a big contribution to all the things that went on. Bob was such a positive, good man in so many ways. Had a great sense of humor. Wasn't easily ruffled. He was he had a good mind, good technical mind, and just good wisdom and judgment all through his career. Bob was a great fellow. We had a fellow by the name of John Shelley. Of course, it goes back to Hugh Jenks was the first man in there, and Hugh Jenks established the refinery. The asphalt operation for the company. Did a great job, and a lot of stories about Hugh Jenks and all the people he knew every place, but he really made an impact for this company. And John Shelley and Roy Compton and people like that were factors in all of that. George Beddoe and others. They were all good people and made great contributions and had good judgment. I've sort of saw a young man in that crowd by the name of Dutch Chatfield. Ross H. Chatfield. And if I ever thought I had any kind of talents at all, it could be being able to reach out and pick great people out of the mass of people. And Dutch was a real winner and still is. Of course, he was so loyal to all those that were above him over the years, and at the time came, he became in charge of that operation. And when he did, he made a lot of things happen. And he took a page out of Mr. Paul Blazer's book, really. Mr. Blazer was thought emulsions were just, Mr. Blazer couldn't believe how great emulsions were, because it was what you did, you added water to the product. And of course, as a result of that, you were selling water to a large degree of the products you're making. And Mr. Blazer liked that because that's big margin stuff.
Right.
And Dutch was the kind of the expert in that. And he went out and made acquisitions and did a tremendous job in building a network of that emulsion business over the years. And I remember we bought out a company. Rex was instrumental in that. I wasn't there at the time. It came about, a company down in Nashville, Tennessee. And the man that we bought it from, his name just slips away. I'll think of it.
Southern States
Asphalt. And the man that ran it, or owned it, he's dead now, but I can't think of his name. But in any case, once he sold the company to us, and it reported to Rex, because Rex was in charge of all sales, we started having problems. And I think by that time that I'd become a vice president of sales then, but Rex was still the guy that was calling those shots. But he was frustrated. Rex was frustrated that this man that owned the company wasn't cooperating, and that was a no-no in Ashland Oil. When you bought a company and you had operated it as part of Ashland Oil, and the people out there that were operating it didn't report back to Ashland in the form that we thought they should, that was a no-no. And so, to make a long story short, I went down and fired most of them. And that put us out on a big limb and put Dutch in charge of it. And so where you needed a lot of help in an area like that, because Tennessee, we didn't have anything else working down there much. We had a little refinery sales operation in Nashville, but when you were selling in the contractor business, you had to be in on the know as to people in Tennessee and
Sure.
politics and all of those kind of things. And so Rex says, I got a lot of faith in this young man you have, but we need somebody down there that's a member of the country club, that gets in the big circles and knows all the people. And we just couldn't think of anybody, but all at once I was sitting back looking out my window one day, thinking about that prospect of who we could get. And I remember Paul Banks, who was the president of Spur Oil Company, retired. Paul was a fine guy, just a man of integrity and good judgment, good manager, good person. And I went in and said to Rex, I said, how about me calling Paul Banks? And he didn't know Paul very well, but I sold him on Paul, and so I went and called him on the phone, then went down and met him, and he says he would take over as the president as long as we left Dutch down there. And so Paul Banks was the president of the company, and Paul handled all the external affairs, and Dutch handled all the operations. And that combination was perfect, and that company grew and just generated profits, and was a great success story. And the moral of that story, again, is, and if there's a thread through Ashland Oil, as I see it over the years, Walter, the thread runs through people, and that's not any big revelation, and most things do. But it was clear in Ashland Oil that we had a lot of disadvantages not having crude oil and those kind of things. And all the other operations, we had to have top people that fitted into that role of whatever they were playing. And that's what generated this company into what it is today. It was having those key people at the right time, at the right place, making the right decisions.
Absolutely right.
And so it's that was interesting. And time you were getting down to Mr. Blazer just before he died, the pure oil acquisition came on the scene. Pure Oil, Union Oil, Fred Hartley. By the way, Fred Hartley died yesterday.
Did he really?
Chairman of Union Oil. Fred Hartley had made a pass at acquiring Pure Oil. Well, by that time, Orrin was becoming a real player, and he was Mr. Paul Blazer's executive assistant, and I think Mr. Blazer had made him, by that time, a senior vice president. Mr. Blazer was still living. And so we got into the boardroom and we talked about it. Mr. Blazer was in California, I remember.
This would have been like early to mid-'60s?
Yeah, no, it was 65.
65.
Well, yeah, it was after 65. It was right. Mr. Blazer died in 66, so it had to be 1965.
Okay.
And I just had started then working for Rex in 65. And, but we put together all the numbers, and then we saw that this was a great opportunity to get by crude oil, because Pure Oil had a lot of reserves of crude. Crude wasn't all that exciting right at that time. Price of crude was around $3 or $2.75 or something. But they had big reserves, and they had, of course, a refinery up at, they had bought the Globe Oil refinery that I was competing with in Chicago. They bought that. It was Pure Oil then. And then they had other refineries up in Ohio, and had a lot of operation. Bill McConnor was the second man to the head man that, and I can't think of his name right now, but in any case, we made a pass at it, and there turned out to be a stockholder that Major Parton was a descendant stockholder, and he was he didn't like the chairman and what they were doing, and he owned a lot of stock. Major Parton was a big stockholder in Pure Oil. And he had an attorney by the name of Darrell Greek. And Darrell Greek came to us and said that with Major Parton's holding in Pure Oil, we can make the deal. And so there was a lot of discussion about it, and so finally what it came down to is that we needed to get to hold of all of their stockholders, because there was going to be an unfriendly takeover that we were going to try to do, because they had already kind of had a marriage going with Union Oil. And so as a result of that, we needed to do things like get stockholders lists so we could write to stockholders and make them an offer ourselves. This is what was going on. We saw later years, and Ashland Oil was doing it because we saw how important it was to get these oil reserves, not to mention the refining and the marketing Pure Oil had. Right. It was a big company, bigger than Ashland. See? Mm-hmm. So Orrin called me and he says, try to figure out some way to get a stockholders list. So Darrell Greek and Ed Monk and I went to Chicago. That was the home office out at Palatine. That was a suburb of Chicago. And to go up there to see what we could do about getting a stockholders list. And so we got in town that night, and Ed Monk and Darrell Greek, and now Darrell Greek's one of the great attorneys, great friend of mine. Now, it's over the years, he lives down in Florida, he's retired now, but what a guy he was, or still is for that matter. But in any case, he managed to go out. We went out to Palatine one day. And Ed Monk had the idea of getting a camera that sort of like, it wasn't as sophisticated as TVs are now, but a camera that he could use, that we could go through and take flash shots of a stockholder book.
I see.
Now, under the law, Darrell Greek went in there and asked for a stockholder list, which they had to give to him. But they didn't have to give him the they didn't have to give him the list to take out.
I see, right.
So he had to have the equipment, and Ed was the one that put that together. And so he went in and took a picture of every one of those sheets and got it out of there and took it out a little bit at a time. We'd stand outside, and we had a little truck of ours, and it was kind of like a spy operation or something. And we got all of that stockholders list to Pure out. And then Ed had figured out a place downtown where they would mail the stuff, and even put the address sheets we already had. They had a machine where they could take the addresses and just paste them on the front, those little slips. And we could have all of that done in before 6 o'clock that night. I couldn't believe that we had the list and we even had the envelopes for it. All we had to have was a letter they were going to send us, and we put it out, and it would go out to all stockholders. This would stop the whole merger with Union and put us in as the top dog on this. Whether we'd ever got it or not, I don't know. But just before we did that, Orrin talked to Mr. Blazer, and evidently Mr. Blazer didn't like the idea. For one reason or another, thought we were overextended. There wasn't anything unethical about it or anything like that. It was just a matter of big debt, to be honest, to do that.
Right.
And Mr. Blazer decided we wouldn't do it. And when we had all the letters in envelopes, and that was 1966. And I still think Mr. Blazer's judgment was always good, and who knows, but what's Darrell Greek, I talked to him not too long ago, he said it turned out that Pure Oil had far more reserves than anybody thought they did in those days.
Yeah, we could use the crude.
And that wasn't long before, it wasn't long after that the crude went up dramatically. See, in 1972, the crude took off.
Now this, Bob, was prior to the Amarada-Hess discussions,
Yeah,
right?
that was prior to that.
Not Amarada-Hess, excuse me, Amarada.
Yeah, Amarada. And it was, that came later, but Mr. Blazer, not long after that, in December, died. And it was, exploration has always been sort of a dilemma for us. As everybody knows, it's been the company. We needed crude oil reserves so much, and we've had a long line of people involved in it going back over the years, and it's been a tough business. George Hardin struggled in it, and of course we had Hop Conger and struggled in it. We've always put a lot of money in it. I even remember going back to my first sales meeting I talked about earlier. When I got to Ashland on the first sales meeting, I was all enthusiastic about being here. That was the time Mr. Blazer had us out on the porch and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it wasn't the first, maybe it was the second sales meeting. Wasn't long after, maybe 3 or 4 months after that. Mr. Blazer talked again, and what we had gone and made a big investment in the Sprayberry area of Texas. And it was a big investment for the company our size in those days. In those days we were making, $20 million at the most a year. That was a big year. And
we bought a lot of leases down there?
No, we got into exploration with some other partners.
I see.
I've forgotten who that was. Bill Seaton would know more about that. Well, I don't know whether Bill was involved back in those days, and I probably wasn't. But in any case, Bill was in charge of it later, as you know.
Right.
But that came to the reality that there was a great loss in that, because it turned out there was oil there, but there wasn't any way to get it out. And one of the problems, I didn't know the technical reasons and all.
Right.
But I remember we talked about in those days the Sprayberry problem. So Mr. Blazer said, with this problem, we're going to have to reduce costs dramatically. And he said, we're going to take so many people out of each department, and we're going to put them in what we call a pool. Remember, we are all listening to this. See, this is like in late 50s. So we're going to put people in a pool, and then see if you'd fit somewhere else in another division someplace. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't, he says, we'll just have to let them go, because we've got to reduce cost because of this problem.
Right.
And so I don't think we ever did let too many people go over it, but it was my first recognition of the problems in exploration. It was a crap game.
Right.
It seemed like the majors had it all. Everything happened good for them and all those things, but we could never seem to get over that hump. And that's why later on, after Mr. Blazer's death, we went after Amarada, which they were a big exploration company, and did a outstanding job, and we talked a lot about that deal, and it came awfully close to coming together, real
close, right.
And they even had set out that Rex was to be the vice chairman and of the board, and the Amarada man would be the chairman, but Orrin would be the chief executive officer and president. That was kind of what they talked about at that time. And all at once, Leon Hess got in the act and made a better offer, just kind of like what we were trying to do with Pure, and Hess got it. And so that was too bad, too. That was in 1969 or something like that. And again, we were on the verge of oil beginning to take off, and which would have made those things even bigger, you know.
Right.
The values.
They had some substantial reserves, maybe not as much as Pure, I don't know. But
well, maybe I just they had a lot of crude in Canada and so forth. And,
right.
They had some exploration overseas and so forth. And then we got looking at Libya.
Oh yeah.
And Orrin got into Libya and the prospects over there, and of course that turned out to be a bad deal with Gaddafi taking over. And just about the time I remember at the board meetings we thought we'd had a big discovery in Libya, and that was just that was. I remember in the board meeting we talked about it, and everybody was kind of rubbing their hands. We're going to have a big strike here, and our stock was already moving because of it, and it didn't turn out to be so.
Remember, we had a fellow, Bob, in marketing by the name of Cliff Clay, who had a brother who was working in Libya with Exxon or SO, whoever it was at that time. And he called Cliff and said, Cliff said, Ashland's going to hit it big. Said it's going to come in tomorrow, and he said, you better get out and buy some stock. So Cliff rushed out, took all of his savings, bought the stock that, as you say, had already been moving up a little anyway, except the announcement didn't come, and it didn't come, and it didn't come, and the stock started slipping off. And 10 years later, Cliff was still sitting on that stock.
Well, he came out all right if he just held on to it.
He did. He did. Eventually, he came out just fine.
But it never was because of expiration that we ever got. Of course, we were in Southeast Asia over there, and Indonesia and places like that didn't work out. We'd always on the verge of a big. But one thing we did in exploration was good. And that is we bought small exploration operations. We bought the Union Carbide reserves, which were relatively small, but we didn't have to pay a lot for them. And we bought Brian Downward's company, the Canadian operation that was an English company. And Brian, that's how it come for Brian to be on the board.
I see.
And and there were other small acquisitions of crude, which turned out to be tremendous. As you know, later on, Orrin sold those reserves, and we hadn't found any. With the ones, most all of them were things we had bought
in Canada.
And
then later on,
not just Canada, but the United States, and there was some out in the West, and there was in Texas, other places where we bought those reserves. But in any case, we ended up when the price was at peak, as you remember, Orrin sold those reserves and got $1.3 billion for them.
Which was a very radical move at that time.
Radical move. People couldn't believe it. That was right in the heart of the biggest. But we all know a lot about Orrin's decisions. That was probably one that was criticized for a lot, but turned out to be a fairly good move at that time.
Ashland, Canada had been sold earlier. Which was primarily a crude oil operation also, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it sold a few years before.
Yeah, some before that had some. I just can't recall. But it was always a dilemma. Of course, we had a lot of things going for us in those times. We started buying our chemical companies and the distribution system. Billy Davis and I went out and bought a lot of those, and one in California and other places, and we'd make our deals, and everybody was wide open to buying them. And we got that distribution thing going, and that was before we had the chemical companies.
Right.
And of course, probably the best merger we ever made was United Carbon. That was United Carbon, I've said over the years, that's where we bought the carbon black plates. And
Right.
of course, they had exploration with it too, which is another part of that exploration package. And that was a great acquisition. That was, and in many ways, it was so good that it spoiled us. We thought that there were so many others around like that I don't think there ever was one any better because they were selling carbon black, and Bob Yancey was not only a great technical man, but he was a great salesman, and he was the one that really went out. And he and John Hall was coming along at that time, and John played a key role in getting with the rubber companies to sell carbon black. And that was an interesting time because we made money in that company and paid it out in just no time at all, and it was a great addition to the company. And finally, of course, we sold the carbon black plates.
Suppose that resulted in John Hall being written up in Rubber World by Otto
Yeah.
Scott. And
Well, I remember Otto Scott, no, Mr. Paul Blazer called me one day, and I think it was this time I'm a vice president, and it must have been just before he died, probably. I wasn't a vice president. I was an executive assistant then. But and he called me and he said, Bob, and I said, yes, sir, Mr. Blazer. And he said, have you read the article in Rubber World written by a man by the name of Otto Scott? And I had. It had just come across my desk about the same time the distribution system worked, you know. And I said, yes, sir. He said, what did you think of it? Whew, boy, that was a tough question because I never knew. You never really knew which way Mr. Blazer was going to go. And he always liked to be kind of on his side. So I said, well, Mr. Blazer, I said, I think it was a good article. And I never knew what was coming. Well, he said, I think that man has caught the concept of our company. And in that article, and the article was about working as sort of as a family and as a group, and communications, weren't too complicated. Everybody knew what everybody else was doing and how we developed it. I think that's about what the article was. But he was delighted with that article, and that's of course when Otto Scott soon got a job with the company and became our communications man. And
so that's how he found Otto.
that's how he found it. Rubber World, and Rubber World was writing for the United for the carbon business, and United Carbon was part of that. He knew all about that and so forth.
Well, did you contact Otto about coming to Ashland?
No, I think Rex did.
Did he?
Or maybe Mr. Blazer probably did, come to think of it, because he was enamored with Otto then about that article. And Otto was a good writer. I mean, he had that talent. And
he was a great admirer of Mr. Blazer's, too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
his
that's
praise for him is unlimited.
That's right. Then along in the 70s, we bought out New Haven Trap Rock, which was, that was following Warren Brothers. We made the Warren Brothers acquisition, and that was I remember that was a good acquisition. It didn't quite fit what we were doing, but we made the OK Tire and the Warren Brothers acquisition about the same time. Warren Brothers came first, but I remember at the board meeting everybody was for it except Mr. Freeman. Mr. Freeman was one of the old directors in Chicago, was in on the very beginning of the company. He was a financial man. I remember Mr. Freeman used to always say when the stock market went down, I think about this last few weeks when it's gone down, Mr. Freeman would always say, boys, when the elephants start to roll, just get out of the way. And I remember at that board meeting that everybody, there was a vote as to whether to make the acquisition. We had it all there, subject to board approval. All these acquisitions, you'd make your deal, and you get it right down to the fine line with whoever you're dealing with, and it was always subject to approval by our board. So when that vote came up, why Mr. Freeman voted against it, and everybody had a great deal of respect for Mr. Freeman. And he said, I just don't like a business where the lowest price gets it. And of course, most of their business was bid business.
Right.
And but then in 1971, we acquired Northwestern, which was a good acquisition, and the Ericksons, and I spent a lot of time up there on that. It was a good refinery up there, and Mr. Elmer Erickson, that's Marilyn Voss's father,
I see.
was the youngest brother of the Ericksons. He had 7 brothers, and Gene's father was the oldest of the brothers.
I see.
And Gene Erickson was working for Elmer, his uncle.
Uh-huh.
And his Elmer had gotten a disease. I don't want to say Alzheimer's, but not Alzheimer's, where it was I can't recall, but it was devastating. He finally died of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew he was ill, and he decided then, and I guess the other brothers in the family, they all had big chunks of stock of that company. And he called Rex. Rex came into my office right and said, I just got a call from Elmer Erickson wanting to know if he was interested. And I think Rex had mentioned to him on occasions it might be.
Mm-hmm.
So we all got on a plane and went up there and made that deal. Orrin Atkins was the negotiator on it, and Rex, and put that together. And that was an interesting company, because it was really a small Ashland Oil. They had Super American stations, of course, and we improved that a lot since then. That whole mix they had was really not profitable, but they had a low transfer price. In those days, gasoline was so cheap. Gasoline was selling for about 12.5 cents a gallon, and they had a transfer price on those stations at 10 cents a gallon. And Walter, you know, being in marketing, when you had a low transfer price, anybody could make money. So first thing we did after we got it, we gave them the same price wholesale jobbers got.
Right.
And so we could tell whether it was profitable, and it wasn't profitable for a long time. And in fact, we finally, Charlie Llewellyn by this time was coming on, and Charlie was involved in sales and head of sales along in that time, and I guess that gets back to when I was president of the petroleum company to kind of end this part of the story. But we just couldn't make money in Super America, and it was a drain, so we decided to sell it. And we got out and went to a lot of people. Finally, Ron Erickson, one of Gene's cousin, Ron was the son of one of the Erickson brothers. I can't think of his name right now, but in any case, he and his father met with us in the boardroom, and his brothers, and Dick Jensen was with us. Dick understood what we were trying to do, and a great guy through the whole thing. And so we negotiated right down to the last, to where it was just about an agreement that we'd all agreed to, and so they said, let's think it over. And it was NPRA, it was the API meeting in Chicago was coming up after that. And so we had a meeting with Ron Erickson. He came in the suite I was in Chicago there at the Blackstone Hotel. And he said, I think Charlie Llewellyn was there, and he came to me and he said, Bob, he says, I've decided now we'll take your deal, the price for the stations and everything. And he said, but we've got to have, I think the number was something like 9.5 cents price, Gulf Coast price, laid in our stations. And of course that was all your transportation, all that.
Right.
And I remember I was irritated over it, and I said, Ron, let's just forget the whole matter and let's never discuss it anymore. He left. And we just started plowing everything into Super America, and I had very little, and Charlie Llewellyn did more to enhance that than anybody, along with Dick Jensen. Dick Jensen was the key, but he and Dick worked close together on that.
Right.
And it was, turns out to be a premier marketing operation today, and that's
Absolutely. That refinery up there, of course, has been very profitable
the
for us
refinery's
also.
been fine. We brought Canadian crude in there, and we used to have to wrestle with the Canadians when we had back when the 70s when it got short. John Hall and I spent a lot of time in Ottawa. Bill Perrine and others. It was a kind of a nightmare again getting crude into those refineries, especially during those tight periods, and so we had it to get in two places, into St. Paul and Buffalo.
Right.
And I remember one time on one occasion we'd get with the top officials in Canada in Ottawa. And one time John Hall just laid it on them, says countervailing duties. In other words, what they were doing, they were selling gasoline into Buffalo cheaper than they were selling us crude. And that was a violation. And when we accused them of that, that got their attention. Because it was a big, we were talking to the State Department and the whole, so those were interesting times,
Right.
to say the least. One of the times before that, earlier on, was Wanda Petroleum.
Oh,
Orrin
yes.
bought that. Orrin was, as we all know, was impatient, and he bought that awfully fast. He was enamored with Nick Morrow. And so we bought it just overnight, and we bought it at the wrong time and ultimately sold it at the wrong time. Just as before the big increase came in petroleum, we had all those inventories down there of propane and so forth, and butane and all those things, which would have gone way up. We sold it just before the break in that. We bought it at so it was the big problem. Charlie Russell, Charlie was an interesting guy in the company, but he did a lot of great things for the corporation. Charlie and I early in our years never got along very well because we were two different personalities, but when he and I started working together, he worked close to me when I was president of the petroleum company.
Right.
And I really come to appreciate him, what a guy he was. And
Smart fellow.
smart
He was
fellow.
manager.
And they sent him down to Houston to run Wanda, or to work in there. He wasn't running it at the time. But he found out that there'd been a little home cooking going with the books early, involving Nick Morrow, and as a result, that was a lot of trauma for a lot of people, because we'd paid way more than we should have paid, because the earnings that they were showing us weren't there.
Or real.
And so, in any case, that was a trauma time for all of us.
Shows you that all acquisitions are not good acquisitions.
But the good acquisitions, we think about Sammy Ross buying those distribution systems and all the things we did in chemicals, were good. I'm sure we had some bad, some not so good. Some may have been, I'm sure, better than others. But for the most part, those early acquisitions, tax-free mergers, and that's those were what we'd give our stock to the people for their stock, and they didn't have to pay any tax on it. There was no tax event on that, and that was a big thing in making the chemical company what it is today, and we're reaping the harvest from that.
Sure.
Because of all that we've gotten. Not to mention the fact that John Hall, who was president of the chemical company for a good while, as you know, he really got things organized, and we'd had 2 or 3 presidents, and things didn't really start to go together until John's leadership got into that. John just had a way of getting things down to earth and well done, and people were supporting him, and success.
Hold it right there, Bob. We're at the end of the tape. We can pick up right there in a minute when they change tapes.
Okay.
Get up and stretch. It's going well.
Yep.
The microphones are working. Just give me time Time to close the door, sir.
Okay. When you shut the door, I'll start.
Yes, sir.
Of course, acquisitions were always interesting in things we did, not only in chemicals, but in our heavy fuel business. We bought a company. First of all, we had hired Jack Blake, who was a great oil man and had been executive assistant for the chairman of Esso for many years. He was a great guy. And he took over the Chicago operations of heavy fuel for Esso. I got to know him years back when I was in Chicago. Not very well, because Jack was a bigger man than I was on the street down there in those days. But in any case, we got the idea that we needed to be in the heavy fuel business more than we were, and so Esso wanted to sell that terminal up there because they had built a refinery down in Baytown where they were going to make a lot of heavy fuel, and they wanted to sell it up in Chicago as well as over in the East Coast. And a big operation, they were going to buy a Metropolitan, so they bought out Globe Fuel, which is different from the Globe Oil Refining up there. They bought Globe Fuel, which is a big heavy fuel operation. Mm-hmm. But when Esso got ready to buy the Metropolitan, the government said, "No, wait a minute, you've got too much business on the East Coast." So the ICC wouldn't let them buy that operation there. So that left them one leg on a three-legged stool that they couldn't produce. So they sold that to us, and we made a lot of money in the terminal up there in heavy fuel. Jack Blake knew everybody, and everybody liked him. Jack came up to me one day and he says, "I've had a great friend over the years, Mr. Jack Connolly, who's the senior, and he has a great operation down in Jacksonville, Florida. It's called Eastern Seaboard." And so I talked to John Hall and Bob Yancey about it, and some with Horn, but they both thought it was something we ought to do, would be interesting. So to make a long story short, we bought that operation and made a deal with Mr. Connolly, and we bought it for $11 million, which for the terminal they had in the operation, that would fit into our whole operations. And so the first year we made $9 million on it.
No, that was a
and
great
of course, the
investment.
environment was good. The heavy fuel was going up in value, and all those things were happening. That was good. And then, of course, we began to put our whole system together with Allied in Cleveland, Jack Blake in Chicago, and Eastern Seaboard in Florida. And Dwayne Gullett was coming on then, and Dwayne did a good job in what he was doing. Particularly, he was in Cleveland at the time. Frank Colgrove was about to retire at that time. May had retired at that time. I'm sure he had now. But those were exciting times. We found a niche in the heavy fuel, and the majors were kind of backing off from it. And then we hit it at a time where the demand was going up dramatically for it, and it was very very good acquisition. And those things were always fun when they came out so well. And Jack Blake was a interesting character. He died a few years back, but he ended up, we just domiciled him down in the Fort Lauderdale apartment down there, and he would stay on the telephone and make more deals in a day than most people would in a lifetime, and that was all brokerage. But you knew the people, Walter, and you had confidence in them. They knew when a deal was, they just had the right kind of smell for a good deal or a bad deal, and as a result, that kind of talent made a lot of money for you.
Did he work for the Allied operation, or?
Yeah, he worked for, and it all meshed together. He and Gullett would be on the phone half the day talking about deals. So they had, and then that's when John Weaver and others were involved in it, and he was with Standard California, and so it was a profitable business, and that was a brokerage business. And those are areas where we always did well, and with very little capital expenditures and very little at risk.
Right.
So it was good returns on investment.
Right.
I guess we come around, actually, even as Ashland Oil got bigger over the years, we operated it sort of like a small business. there was not a lot of bureaucracy in Ashland. Never has been.
I think that's exactly right.
And there's a great lines of communications, and everybody in the company, we all liked each other, and that was important.
Always been a lot of communication between the bottom and the top in
Right.
Ashland.
Yeah.
Very unusual for a company this size.
Right. John Hall and I were always close. We kind of knew what each other was thinking most of the time. Charlie Llewellyn and I were close. Charlie and I grew up together as in refinery sales. He was hired maybe 3 or 4 months after I was, and a talented guy. And he and I are a lot different than each other, but we worked together well and we communicated well. But it was fun. One of the things that, of course, Ashland in those days were interested in all external affairs a great deal. Like Paul Blazer was always encouraging people to be involved in things outside the company, be a part of it. And of course, it took a lot of time when you were putting as much time as you did in Ashland Oil to do that. But he insisted on it, and Rex Blazer did. He thought that was important to do. And Mrs. Georgia Blazer, of course, was on the board of trustees at University of Kentucky back years ago. I got a letter, a speech that she had written in 1951 or 2.
Is that right?
And it was a jewel. And I circulated to all the board of trustees at the University of Kentucky when I was chairman of the board there, and circulated widely. And I got comments about it, and somebody from the university had sent it to me. And she had written a great document that's filed away now in a lot of people's keep files, because she was an extraordinary woman.
She's still alive, right?
Still alive, and bless her heart, what a contribution she made for Mr. Blazer over those years. And Rex, of course, was involved at the university early. He was first chairman of the fellows program. And we had a meeting not too long ago at the university, and somebody got up and says, now the first chairman of the fellows was somebody, and I was quick to correct him. I said the first chairman was Rex Blazer, and Mr. Dabney played a key role in the development council. In fact, at the university, he was instrumental in getting me involved in it. Mr. Dabney was on the development council.
Ed Dabney.
On our board.
From Lexington, I believe.
Yeah, he was banker at Lexington, and he was Walt Hellemeyer's boss.
Right.
And he was, Mr. Blazer thought a lot of him, and he was a good director, very intelligent, ethical man. He was quite a person. I remember we had one time Rex was getting involved down at UK a good bit, and he got Oswald to come down here for a university affair. That was in the 60s, late 60s. They honored Rex for what contribution he had made and all those things. And then in later years, I guess it was in the late 70s, Orrin was instrumental in giving $1 million to the university. Otis Singletary, of course, I was kind of pushing on that too, because it was important. But
when did you go on the board down there, Bob?
I went on the board in 1980.
80, and then became chairman when?
In 83.
83.
And I was chairman through 1988.
Right.
And that's the year. And then I was chairman of the search committee that got David Rozelle as the new president.
Right. A lot of things happened during that time.
A lot of things, yeah, really did.
A lot of progress made.
It was an interesting thing to do, and it was and there's been a closeness between the University of Kentucky and and Ashland Oil, and
Sure.
the two biggest things in Kentucky, really, and people think of it that way. And I think it's been great thing for the university to have that close relationship with the corporation, and I think it's been great for Ashland Oil to have that kind of relationship too.
You bet.
So it's because a lot of graduates come from there that work for the company. But the '70s, of course, was exciting times, but it was when the controls went on and all those things happened, and we had the political campaign contribution problem that came about. That was a kind of a stress period for us all, and it was interesting because most all corporations in the final analysis, somewhere or another, corporate funds were getting into political campaigns, and it had gone on from the beginning, probably from George Washington's time.
Right.
And then it all came out in the Nixon's dilemma there at Watergate. But of course, Orrin again was impatient. He had to go right out front, and of course that got more publicity than anybody else. And
True.
some of the good companies we know came in last, and nobody ever thought any more about it. It was old news, and
Yeah.
it didn't matter very much. But what wasn't old news in that time is that in 1973 is when the shortage began. You know, we had the first big crisis, that the lines at service stations and all those things. And then Bob Yancey was head of the Washington office at that time, and Bob served the company well in all that he did and the connections he had up there at that time. Bob was a great salesman and a great technical man to boot, and John Hall's the same way. The two of those together was quite a combination. But in those years, we had to figure out a way, and no one really understood the entitlement program.
And Bob, you were president of Ashland Petroleum Company
Right.
at this time.
Right.
The Arab oil embargo came along in early '74 or
Right.
late '73,
And
it's a very difficult time for the company.
then they, in 1973, in '74 is when they did it, but they went back to May of 1973 and established a margin, whatever your margin was for gasoline or petroleum products. On that day, that was your margin.
Right.
And I remember, of course, we had, Charlie Russell and I had been working on that. And Charlie came later. He went later. I became president in '74 of the petroleum company. But that margin at that time, it just so happened that it was a time when we had just raised prices, so we ended up with a good margin. I remember one night at home when that announcement came out sometime like in February of '74 that they would take that margin back.
70.
And Orrin called me, and boy, I tell you, he could really be wild on the phone sometime. And he thought, what in the world is this thing? And what are our margins? And I said, we just checked it before I left the office. And I said, we just couldn't be better off than we are. And it wasn't any great wisdom or anything. We were lucky. We'd had some bad luck, so we deserved some good once in a while.
Right.
But in any case, that prevailed. But what the concept was, you see, you had the old oil and the new oil. And the old oil was oil that was already recognized as reserves in the ground, and the new oil was oil that was just coming on to be produced. And so they froze the old oil at low levels. And then, they had all kinds of layers later on, which complicated it all. But most of the people that never really understood the impact of this, I think a lot of people in our accounting never really understood it, but thought entitlements was something we were getting free. But for example, if you had buying from a company that had old oil at say $3 frozen,
Right.
then he couldn't raise his price any over and above his margin, so he could be selling for 28 cents a gallon, for example. But if you were making your products out of new oil, or uncontrolled oil, your price could be 56 cents. And that's what happened for, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. You had all this disparity of prices. Well, you know that wasn't going to last very long because you had 2 senators in every state. For the state of Ohio, the price was way up compared to Indiana, where there was a lot of oil over there that was old oil coming right into the refineries there. So you know that the senators from Ohio was going to create a law, and many more states were the high price and they're low price, that all of this old oil would be spread among everybody, so that one citizen wouldn't have to pay more than another, which was the only fair thing to do.
Right.
And then they had a ceiling over and above whatever that margin was on May 15th, 1973, on top of whatever oil you got. So the way they did it is they said anybody that ran new oil got an entitlement from some company that had all old oil, and they would pay you entitlements that would level the price of crude out throughout the nation. And so we were, of course, always on the high end of the totem pole as far as crude was concerned. And of course, the other high-priced crude was, of course, foreign crude. It didn't have any controls on it, so you had to average that down on all the domestic crude. And we were taking a lot of foreign crude. So as a result, we would get big checks from Shell Oil every month on entitlements. And of course, the earnings were good in those days because of that margin in 1973. And so we had some great years, and of course it was kind of got hairy when we had to get so much crude from places like Iran and so forth.
Difficult times in terms of trying to determine what the regulations were really saying and how you complied and how you ran the business.
Yeah, and you wanted to make sure that you did everything. Then that's when we had to have people. That's when Charlie Russell really got into it. Then they also had in the 70s an inflation rule.
Right.
And we had to watch that if we went over that. If you made more than you should make on that complicated formula. Charlie did all of that.
Right.
And did it well. And you had allocations for your service stations and all those kind of things. It was, but we did it, and we had good people. And during the 70s, the company did well. It was fun and exciting, and of course, then when we go overseas to try to go to these places like Abu Dhabi and others to try to get more crude because it was so important. And of course, we had one of the great things we had was about 20,000 barrels a day of crude from Saudi Arabia, and they were lower than everybody. And of course, they were the big supplier for the Aramco partners. So the Aramco partners, which were Mobil and Exxon and Standard of California and Texaco, they had the big advantage during that whole period. And of course, they did real well with that crude. All other foreign crude was much higher than the Saudis. Remember, the Saudis were selling lower than anybody.
Right.
But we managed to it all, and it was interesting during the time. And of course, we spending time in all the places. Iran was one that a number of us spent a good bit of time. And then when the Shah was overthrown, that was really a period that we had a good relations over there all the time that the Shah was there, and I'd say it was good. It was fairly good. It was never really great with Iran. It was always raising the price, and they were always cutting you down and giving you more heavy crude than light, and it was always tough dealing with them. But and then when the revolution occurred in there, then that was really a tough time.
Well, you were there just about that time, weren't you?
Yeah, it was in. Actually, the revolution occurred sometime in. Revolution occurred sometime in '78. The Shah went out, and then you had all the. Then Khomeini took over, and that was always tough things because the Shaw was still, as you remember, went to Mexico and then became ill, and all those things took place. And at one time when the Shaw was in New York, that's when we were over there, and they had a big riot at that time, and Charlie Dugan and Charlie Llewellyn and I were there. I think Charlie was there on that one trip, but it was a interesting time, to say the least. Then the time that when they took the hostages, that was in late '79.
Which time was it, Bob? I think I've heard you tell a story about being in the hotel room and listening to the executions going on.
Yeah, what happened was that after the revolution, no one thought about going over there until they invited us over there. Bob Yancey and John Hall went over, and that's when Khomeini agreed to, if we would take the first shipment of oil, that they would give us a contract of 150,000 barrels a day, which was a big contract, especially oil was very tight then. It would be at the going OPEC price. And so we agreed to do that. And we did do it. We ended up being the second ship. I think the Japanese got the first ship. That was the first shipment of oil after the new regime had taken over. And then this contract was very valuable. And we thought, boy, this is going to really provide us a great source of crude, Iranian light mostly. And so I think John was there and Charlie was there in the summer of '79, and they talked about the contract, and they made some changes in it, and then we went back. Charlie Llewellyn was on the next meeting with me, and Dugan was at all the meetings. And that was back in, that must have been November or late October. And that was on the occasion when we could hear, we stayed in the hotel. Now the hotel, we didn't stay in the hotel that time. It was in the summer. I was there, yeah. It was in the summer that we were met with the officials there and Azimi. And in that meeting is when we went back to the hotel. You could see it in the streets that things, there were signs around and all those kind of things. But we were still in the hotel, and that was the night that we'd wake up, or at least I did. Of course, your times was 8.5 hours difference. Over in Iran, they don't change the hours by hours. They change it by 15 minutes across the nation. So Tehran's 8.5 hours different from this time. But in any case, I woke up, or never really gone to sleep too well. We never were concerned or frightened, at least I wasn't. And I don't think anybody else was. But just as I got to sleep, I heard something just sound like firecrackers. Now, Tehran is sort of like, a little bit like Denver. It's got a big kind of the mountains out in the back. Caspian Mountains are out in the back, and it's kind of a flat city all down around the mountains. And so at night, there was a curfew. Nobody was out at night. And you could hear most anything, but the window was up in the room, and all at once you could hear something like firecrackers, like somebody throw a whole thing of firecrackers out maybe 6 blocks down the street. Well, I got up it woke me up, and I got up and looked at my watch, and it was like 12 o'clock. Then it all at once, I didn't go back to sleep, and I heard it again in a half hour. Then I heard it again at 1, and I heard it again at 1:30. And of course, obviously, when we met with officials the next day, one of the guys came up to us and said, you know, so-and-so down the hall, said they came in here yesterday and blindfolded him and shot him last night.
Wow.
Yeah, I said, yeah, I heard the shots.
Tough time.
That was tough time. Then the next meeting is when we were over there and we settled. That's when they really got into hardball with us. They said, first of all, they'd always start a meeting and tell you all the bad things that they were going to do. It never was a meeting that was conciliatory at the beginning. You know, it was always take the wind out of you. Start with that. Maybe that's the way they negotiated or whatever. But this time, we met with the Revolutionary Council, whatever that was. They all, the fact that people that we had dealt with all these years, or all the time it hadn't been a lot of years, but some, they told us this now. The Revolutionary Council was going to come in. It was a little boardroom, not as big as our boardroom at home, but it was a fairly long table and the windows looking out on one side and fairly austere room. And so they said the Revolutionary Council is going to come in a few minutes. We said, oh, is that right? So they filed in and then just filled up the room. And then with that, they started in on us saying how bad we were, that we had never done anything for Iran, we'd taken all their oil, and then that's when we got into that we needed to take, we had two VLCCs that were in the area. One was to be loaded the next day, and they pressed the point to where we'd have to pay $45 a barrel for that, or not have a contract starting the next year. See, this was in October, only 2 more months to go, about the same time of year we're in right now. And so, of course, we argued with that and pleaded and all the things that they had back in the earlier meeting that in the summer when we heard the shots, back in July, I think it's when it was, they had cut our contract dramatically and made us have more heavy oil than we wanted or could use, and cut our light down. We had 150,000 barrels, and they cut us all the way down to 110 or something like that, with most of it being heavy. We called Bob Yancey that night and got Bob. I guess we tried John too, but didn't talk to him. But we talked to Bob, and we said, Bob, we knew, of course, the phones were always tapped. You could hear it click in when you pick it up at home. So they knew they had you all tapped in there. And so Bob answered the phone, and I said, Bob, got some problems over here in Tehran. I said, number one is we're going to have to take more heavy crude, and they're cutting our total volume down from 150, which they'd agreed on back here earlier in February, to 110. And Bob says, I told you you couldn't trust those son of a bitches. And I said, now, Bob, you've got to realize that these people over here have had some hard times. I said, for goodness sakes, they have a lot of problems over here, and we've got to be very lenient with them. I knew they were plugged in on every word we were saying.
Right.
That was the same night I could hear the shots fired. But anyway, back in October when we had that meeting, we finally resolved it. We didn't resolve it. We were just beat up because they cut way back on our supply, and I think they were going to cut our contract the next beginning of the next year, which would be the January next 1980. And so as a result of that, we left and we went. Of course, we didn't spend the night then because it was really getting hairy, and you could just see every 17-year-old had a gun over his shoulder, machine gun. I mean, guns were everywhere. Signs, down with Carter, and the American pigs. And of course, we were riding around in a big black U.S. Buick, probably the only American car within 10,000 miles of the place. And people would look in the windows, and we just kind of smile and ride along. And I will say the NIOC kind of took pretty good care of us and got us back to the airport and everything. But it was a tough time. It was
scary time.
Then when we got out to the airport, there was people that Iranians were around us that worked with us, or one guy we'd been with had carried the bags for us or something, and wanted to give us money to get back to his children in the United States. Some money. It was chaos.
Right.
We had the G2 there, and Dick Braddock and John Jones were the pilots. John Jones was he was pretty tense that day.
I'll bet.
And so we got on the plane, and we weren't all that concerned, really, thinking back on it. But what we were concerned about was the bad deal we'd gotten from the Iranians. They really had abused us in the contracts. I mean, they had signed a contract, agreed to it, and that's all we talked about it. But it didn't make any impact on them.
Right.
But in any case, we flew out of there, and then it was the next day, the day after the next day, they took the hostages in the embassy, which was just down the street from where we were.
It's too close for comfort.
Yeah, it was. It was. Then we had to go to the Office of Hearing Appeals, and that was a fellow by the name of Goldstein in Washington, because he'd set up an office to be able to allocate crude to companies that didn't have it, because refineries, if a refinery ran out, it was a disaster, because areas like this whole area of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio, and Pennsylvania would be out of petroleum products. So we had to make a case, and that went on. We had to prepare it all. By that time, I was Bob Yancey Jr. was my executive assistant then, and we had to get together all the papers and all the statistics that we needed to try to prove that we had to have this allocation. And John Hall testified, I testified, John and Bob Yancey testified, and we prevailed. We got 85,000 barrels a day of allocated crude from the other majors, so that we could have crude, and that was interesting, because we hadn't really thought we'd pull that off, and especially that much. That was another example when it seemed like when we thought we were out on the floor, we got back up and just worked day and night, and we overcame it. And that was a lot of work to get that done. And we had a good attorney and good advice, and that was the bottom line to it all.
Worked out great.
And then of course, the 80s was tough times. We went into the 80s. There was obviously then there was surplus refining capacity. That made margins. Everybody thought that there'd never be an end to the shortages, and refineries were built, and old ones were glued back together, and as a result, way over too much refining capacity. What had really happened to, and it's a simple lesson in economics, what really took place is that with the shortage, it caused prices to go up and up and up. Obviously, because of the shortage, supply and demand, not enough demand, not enough to supply, and demand was really roaring. Everybody all had their big guzzler cars. We had all these things, and the consumption was high. And so after a period of time, when the prices are so high, the old 101 economics began to work. And as a result of that, demand went down. People began to find conservation in many ways. They didn't drive as much. Smaller cars began to come out sooner or later. And so into the 80s, we ended up with way over too much refining capacity. And that was a tough time because we didn't see much light at the end of the tunnel then, and that refining was our biggest business, and the chemical business then was not so good. There's a surplus of everything, and margins were poor. And so then that was about the time, well, it was a little before that's when Orrin had sold the crude that we had, and we ended up with a fair amount of cash at the time. But we made, with the decision to sell the crude and getting a big price out of it when we did. It wasn't that much crude that could have served all of our refineries, but it was a lot of money, $1.3 billion.
Right.
And Orrin was always impatient, even though we looked at a lot of companies, but we bought Inigon and U.S. Filter. And both of those companies cost us a lot. And that was basically what went with the oil money, selling the oil.
What do you think the strategy was in buying those two companies, Bob?
Well, I don't know. We had of course a lot of Orrin was he was enamored with a lot of people who were making classic presentations on how to make 2 and 2 equal 5, and how to put companies together and all these things. And some of it had worked to some degree, but we were thinking about getting diversified. That was sort of popular then. Not have all your eggs in a basket, and plus the fact that the oil business had been so good, the refining business, and now it was so lousy. Maybe this was the end of it. We'd better start to find a way out of this crack that we're in. And so the insurance business, I really knew very little about the insurance business, or nothing at all. And but anyway, we bought the company, and even after we were operating it for some time, Bill Seaton was the one that had to deal with it, and it wasn't. It was good people and nice people to deal with and all, but the business wasn't. We just didn't understand it, and it went from bad to worse. And of course, U.S. Filter, Orrin had bought 51% of it from the shell shock people. That was the Germans that owned 51% of it. When he did that, he had to go buy the other 49% because you had it on your balance sheet anyway. With 51%, you had all the debt on your own balance sheet, so you had to go get the other 49 because you're only getting 51% of the profits. So that's the last thing you ever want to do, is get control of a company and assets and not have all the profits.
Right.
And so that's when he went and bought the rest of it from Ray Rich. And of course, Ray Rich we paid way too much for it. And as a result, it just, to this day, even this last month, we've had write-offs.
That's right.
Because here we are in 1990, we're still taking a bath on U.S. Filter. It's just, makes you want to cry sometime when we make those kind of deals. And we got out of our mold to some degree because these were big acquisitions, 2 of them, and
Close together.
And Orrin at that time was even thinking about merging with Total. That began to. We all understood that refining business was in tough straits at that time, but not bad enough to get with Total and a French company. And so we had to deal with some of those things. And as we know, that in 1981, Orrin had just got completely bored with the business, I think, and it was hadn't been too much fun. The fun had gone out of it. The good days were over, and he was impatient. He was trying to make things happen, and the rest of us were becoming frustrated. And as a result, why in 1981, Orrin leaves the company, as you know. And that was a great day because John Hall was the chairman. And John Hall is I mean, he was a perfect mix for this whole new operation that was to come on. And not to say that it wouldn't have tough years for a long time after that, but John has the leadership qualities, the technical background, the salesmanship, and the ability to bring a little humor into things and not be quite so serious about everything. It's the basket's half full, not half empty. So that was a great thing for the company, and it was important that he become the chairman. And I think the other thing that was especially good at that time is that was the fact that we had an outstanding board. During all this time, our board was working well with us on all of our problems and all of our difficulties, and that it was an important time that we have a good board, and we had it at that time. And the meeting, I think, it was an amiable meeting when Orrin left. The outsiders of the board made the final decisions, and we came in right after that. And so it was over. Bob Bell, for example, worked closely with me, during that time, and come on with the company in 1978, and we were building a governmental relations department, and media relations, and the education program that was coming on that we were really organized on. And Bob Bell was a talented guy in all of that. I knew Bob back in school. He was a couple of grades ahead of me in school, but we were in fraternity together, and close friends. And Bob was interested in government in those days. He'd gone in that direction in his college education, and he had some great teachers that convinced him that's what he ought to do, and he did get into it and enjoyed it and did it well, and he was instrumental in Ned Breathitt getting elected governor at one time and all those things. But then Bob, at the time, I just caught him at the right time. He was a secretary of the environmental relations or environmental affairs for Judy and Carroll, Governor Carroll, and so Bob is there ever was a man of integrity, it's Bob Bell, and when anything that wasn't quite above board, why Bob got frustrated about it and got out of it, and that's what he did during that time. And I just happened to catch him at the right time and hired him.
Kind of brought a new perspective to the company.
Right, and he had an experience and a background that none of the rest of us had, and so Mac Zackham, of course, had been in Washington for a number of years, and of course, Mac is another one of those guys that talk about Dutch Chatfield. Mac is one of those guys I saw out in the crowd.
Yeah.
Where I saw Mac in the crowd once was, I didn't hardly know who he was, but he was kind of a representative for us one way or the other back in those days, and it was right in the middle of the energy crisis, and I was on a panel in one of these TV shows, and there was a coal man, there was a gas man, and a utility man, and an oil man, and I was the oil person. So we were getting all ready. It was a big TV deal, and moderators and reporters. Had 4 reporters out there and 4 of us. And so Mac got in with the group of the reporters, was standing around, and they were talking, and he was just acting like he was one of them. We weren't communicating. And so it wasn't a few minutes, we were all sitting down on the desk. Mac just walks over just before it starts and says, "Bob, there's a list of the questions." And I said, That was the best performance I ever made on TV. All the other guys stuttered and had to think and all that. But I saw all the questions down there, so I said, well, I'm glad you asked that question. And
That's great.
from that time on, Mac was on his way. I said, there's a guy that is really instrumental in getting me off the hook on a TV show. Why, he's really going to go places. So he did, and he worked up in the Washington office, as you know, for a long while and did a great job. And the thing I always noticed about Mac is when we would go up there for a luncheon, Bob Yancey and I'd go up there a lot. And the other groups would always be there to be around us for a nice luncheon that would take place. But Mac was always too busy to have lunch with us. He had an appointment on the Hill, or he had an appointment in administration or something, and those things impressed me.
Hustler.
And Bob Bell liked Mac, and Mac reported to him from up there. And when Mac became in charge of the Washington office, and I think he learned a lot from Bob. And then Dan Lacey. Dan Lacey's was just a nice little guy around here. And when Bob Bell got a hold of him and taught him a lot of things and worked with him, why Dan got to be a pro in all the things. I think he's the best in the business in this public relations. And,
Yeah, I agree.
and Bob got Roy Compton, and Roy Compton, of course, played such a great role in the whole Bellsburg affair, as you know. By the way, Jack Dahl was another. I had a great team over at the end of the building. Jack Dahl, and Jack was a great guy and doing swell now in Super America and all. And then Mac, and then Dan Lacey and all that crew. And Frank Justice worked with us on a lot of things, and Frank's a good, solid guy. But during the Bellsburg attempt, as you know, that came about in 1986.
Mm-hmm.
John Hall and I were at an NPRA meeting in California. And before that time, my job, of course, was also included at that time our investor relations with Bill Hartle in New York. Bill Hartle does a good job up there for that. And he and I always worked together, and he's a great guy. And so we had gotten some words from Al Freed that our stock, funny things were happening. All at once we'd have a big buyer come in for a stock, and then it would lay back for a while. Then a big buyer would come in for a stock. And so we couldn't figure it out. And finally we came to the conclusion that it was a foreign investor. And of course we were thinking about the Middle East or someplace like that. But when John and I got out in California, and it was along about November of 1986. No, it was the spring of '86. It was must have been April, March or April. And John got the poison pen letter from the Bellsburg that they were ready to make a move on us and had bought substantial stock. It turned out, as it is, that they were a foreign company because they were from Vancouver, Canada. But,
right.
we had missed that. And we had a lot of experts trying to work on that. So that was a trauma for us. I remember Fred Hartley had come up to me out at the NPRA. I had just become president of the NPRA that year.
Mm-hmm.
Or I was going to be president-elect, and I presided over the meeting that day. And Fred Hartley came up to me after the meeting. He said, well, he says, there's nothing worse than having one of these takeovers come to you. And he says, of course, it ruined his company because
Then Pickens came after him twice.
Pickens came after him, and then he had to leverage the company so high that all that debt, is still on Union. And so in any case, he said, good luck. And so John went out earlier, but I had to stay to preside over the meeting. I was chairman, NPRA meetings. And so Donna was with him, and she had to go back to Florida or something, and Niall was with me. So the girls left, and then I flew out the next day to New York, and John had already been there, and we got First Boston to start working with us on it, and boy, that was a war room in those days. That was got all around, and it was tough. One of the key things of the whole matter was that it just so happened that the Kentucky legislature was in session. And Roy Stevens, who was one of Bob Bell's men,
Mm-hmm.
and who everybody in Frankfort liked Roy, and that's a tough job to be in a place like Frankfort in politics, and everybody likes you.
You bet.
Well, we got a Kentucky law that put into place during that legislature that had certain stipulations that the board of directors had to approve this and that and all this and all the requirements in the Kentucky law, and it was there for purpose of a company like Ashland Oil not being taken over and lost in Kentucky, not being any longer a corporation here. And some of the lawyers at the time up there in New York didn't think that law really meant very much, but in the final analysis, it was the key to saving us from being taken over for the Bellsburgs. And then the stock was going up, you remember, just dramatically going up.
Right.
And as a result of all that, we were able to get our stock back from the Bellsburg at a price well under what the market was.
Right.
And John Hall did a good job on that. He was a cool head, John, at that time. He prevailed in the deal. We got through it, and a lot of good men like John Dansby and Jim Boyd and all were up there. All we read about these takeovers and strategies and all that. Now we were really in the fire. We were on the playing field. It's like a practice session in football, and now all at once you're thrown down. You're in the Rose Bowl now. What do? Pass, kick, or run?
That's right.
And I think everybody performed really great.
Our leveraged ESOP came out of that, Bob.
Yeah, we got the ESOP deal out of it, and the LESOP, and
Did a lot of
and then the company just from a structure standpoint just came out great in that whole period.
sure did. Stronger than ever.
In many ways, you're right. And then the final chapter of that is the Bellsburgs were later convicted of stock parking. They were buying, like going back when Al Freed and I were talking about it. We knew they were buying. Somebody was buying a lot of stock, but must have been buying more than 5%.
Mm-hmm.
What they were doing, they were getting Bear Stearns to buy it,
Mm-hmm.
and so with the idea of wink that I'll buy it back from you at your price
Right.
for a little bonus or something.
Profit. Right.
And of course, that's a violation that you see right today in the milking deal. That was parking stock. That was Boski's problem. And that's Bellsburgs were doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't. So you're supposed to announce that you're going to take over a company if you have 5% of the stock. They ended up with almost 9% before they announced, and they had the other 4% parked over here with another guy that was to give them the wink when they wanted it.
Right.
So that was an interesting development out of all that. And I think we came out as a stronger company out of adversity there.
I agree.
Then, of course, we had the kind of the saddest and darkest time of our history is in those lawsuits that it was so frustrating for all of us, and it was so uncalled for. I'll live a long time before I ever realize or understand how people could do those things. No one in this company ever had any experience with that kind of attitude or that kind of motivation, and the management and a lot of time and effort went into that, and it turned out badly all the way around, and it was a sad note, but we got it back of us, and we're learning how to get up off the floor again as we haven't before. But I have to think that a lot of times that adversity makes you stronger. I think that anybody that has done anything in life, you'll find over the years they've had their tough times. And out of those, if you can really get better and stronger from that, you're going to be a better person or a better company. And the this right after resolving that problem, then we're into the Pittsburgh oil spill. And John handled that so well in dealing with that.
Let's hold it right there now. We're through with this tape. He just motioned us a minute ago before we move into the Pittsburgh thing.
Okay, well, that's getting close to the end for me.
Okay.
Huh?
Okay. He's got to change tapes. Yeah, it is kind of